There seems to be a lot of talk about traffic fatalities on the topic of cannabis legalization, how traffic fatalities increase after states start legalizing or something, and so I'd like to give my 2 cents on the issue. I've always been a fan of the concept of looking at historical trends on these things rather than try to just associate increased traffic deaths in a particular area before versus after. Now, I know that there is value to that, but I think it's also important to keep things in perspective. So let's look at this article I saw today about cannabis and how traffic deaths have trended in areas in which the laws have changed. So the article is called Traffic Fatalities on a High After Cannabis Legalization. This is from medicalexpress.com. Monash University researchers examined the effect of recreational cannabis sales on traffic fatalities in 3 U.S. states where it was legalized: Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, and 9 neighboring jurisdictions from 2009 to 2016. The researchers looked at the number of additional deaths each month after legalization and found that there was on average 1 additional traffic fatality per million residents in comparison to states that had not changed cannabis laws. The increase was temporary, seeming to last for about a year following legalization. The combined population of affected areas is 27 million people, suggesting an additional 170 deaths in the first 6 months after legalization. But the study reported the spillover effects to be slightly larger in neighboring states and provinces, particularly those with population centers closest to the border of a legalizing state, possibly because cannabis users were driving interstate to make purchases before returning under the influence. It's called cannabis tourism, and Monash University's Dr. Tyler Lane said that there are important implications for both legalizing states and their neighbors as prohibitions against cannabis use are lifted globally. The effect of cannabis legalization on traffic fatalities is a growing public health concern, Dr. Lane said. The results suggest that legalizing the sale of cannabis for recreational use can lead to a temporary increase in traffic fatalities in legalizing states. This spills over into neighboring jurisdictions through cross-border sales, trafficking, or cannabis tourists driving back to their state of residence while impaired. Our findings suggest that policymakers should consult with neighboring jurisdictions when liberalizing cannabis policy to mitigate any deleterious effects. Dr. Lane said that the findings were in contrast to research on medicinal cannabis suggesting that it decreases traffic fatalities. One reason for the difference may be that medical users tend to substitute cannabis for other substances, including alcohol, which has a greater effect on impairment. Recreational users are less likely to substitute and are more likely to combine alcohol and cannabis, which has a much bigger effect than either in isolation. Now, I could think of a few other reasons why driving fatalities would be up just by a cursory Google search that don't actually involve cannabis intoxication. Off the top of my head, the fact that for 2 years prior there was a massive hype building up as the first state in the country legalized recreational, and there was a massive initial boom that eventually faded, and there was a huge trend with cannabis tourism. This much is true, but whether this is to be expected to continue, and therefore whether it's generalizable to other scenarios, and indeed nationally, if we would make this a thing across the nation, has to be independently analyzed. And other factors have to be taken into account. After more states start legalizing recreational, as was the case in subsequent years, there was hardly a similar hype in those areas. At 10 legal states and DC for recreational, it's hardly a new thing nationally anymore for a state to legalize recreational cannabis. So the increased traffic, to the degree with which it happened in Colorado, that could have actually caused a massive spike in drivers on the road and contribute to driving fatalities, may not be generalizable as the trend continues and goes across the nation, and as time goes on in those states. The hype will probably die down, as they say it did in Colorado, since they said it was a temporary increase. But other than that, I think it's also important to look at national trends and state trends using other factors to see how, through this massive legislative movement in the last decade or so, we understand if this is having an effect nationally. And also, I think it's just important in general to understand how other factors may be playing into these increases that they're reporting. So here's the historical trend on driving fatalities per 100,000 residents. Notice something? It's been trending down consistently since 1960. In fact, traffic fatalities were at their highest in the 30s. 1969 was the 6th worst year in American history at 26.42 per 100,000, and has been falling pretty significantly ever since. Even since 1996, where medical started, fatalities have been falling. There are a lot of things that play into this, obviously, so I think it's ridiculous to just point the finger at cannabis intoxication and say that this was the cause of this year-over-year spike. I should also point out that during the time that this study was carried out, between 2009 and 2016, the total miles driven on Colorado roads, the VMT on this graph, has been steadily increasing since the early 2000s. And particularly since 2008-2009, it's been actually pretty significantly spiking. And traffic fatalities are also down in Colorado, as indicated by this graph, relative to the early 2000s. The percentages indicate the magnitude of change since 2002. While it is true that the magnitude of change since that benchmark has gone down markedly during the time frame studied between 2009 and 2016 as the driving fatalities started increasing again, it's still significantly lower than 2002. In fact, the decreases in the years immediately prior to the year's studies were actually going against the trend of how much driving took place during that year. And as that trend actually increased, fatalities decreased. But as we go through the late 2000s and 2010s, it actually begins to track again with that trend as total driving increases significantly, and driving fatalities start tracking upwards again. So I think that there are other explanations here than simply people driving high after legalization. It's also important to notice how trends with people wearing seatbelts and motorcyclists not wearing helmets are going, because unrestrained drivers not wearing seatbelts, actually accounted for over half of the driving fatalities in 2016. And there was a 50% increase in motorcyclists without helmet fatalities since 2012, as motorcycle fatalities hit an all-time high during that same year. And I have to ask, are they actually counting all of that? Are they taking all of that into account when they're calculating these increases? I would suggest no, and I would suggest that this has something to do why there was an increase in driving fatalities in the years following legalization. And they could have absolutely nothing to do with the people being intoxicated at the time, as the author of the paper and the author of the study emphasize during this article. But let's go back to the article. One new traffic fatality per million means an increase of 1.2 million per 100,000 per year. And the author stated that it was a temporary increase as well. In a total area of 27 million people that was analyzed, you see an additional 170 traffic fatalities in the first 6 months after legalization, during which time between 2009 and 2016, the figure fluctuated around 11 per 100,000 nationally, give or take, within a percent. Since I'm not aware of what jurisdictions they use, and since they didn't make that clear in the article, let's just take national data, and if we do that, it equates to around 3,000 deaths in total per year, with some year-over-year fluctuation total. 340 additional deaths per year yields around 12.26 per 100,000 in those jurisdictions. Meaning, even if we were to see this kind of trend spread nationally, it would be similar to kind of numbers we saw in 2008, and still significantly down from what it was in the 90s through the 2000s. I think that what we need to acknowledge is that this is a modest increase that warrants some concern, but it's also an issue, I think, of seeing a slight increase and perhaps attributing it hastily to the subject of your study, cannabis intoxication and the consequences of legalization. I think there's a bias here, that there's a preconceived notion of what to attribute this increase to. It could be due to cannabis intoxication, but as they mentioned, it could also be due to more people coming into these states to buy cannabis and go back to their state of residence. Whether or not they're intoxicated is basically speculation as far as I can see. This means more cars on the road, means more potential for accidents. And with as large a boom as happened in 2014 around Colorado, it makes a lot of sense. Is it possible that they're more likely to be under the influence? Yes. But hey, how about we take into consideration the other factors, like, the all-time high motorcyclist fatality rate in 2016, and the fact that half of them weren't wearing helmets, or how people without seatbelts were overrepresented in driving fatalities during that year? They say this contrasts the trend we see with medical legalization and driving fatalities. But honestly, it makes a lot of sense to me, as the state liberalizes their drug policy such that out-of-staters can legally buy cannabis, and cannabis becomes legally available to everyone in that state. More people will come from other states to buy it at first, and people will be more likely to travel to buy it at first than they would ordinarily. This means more people are driving to get something and are using Colorado's roads that's very popular already, and that has been for a long time, and that there's been a huge hype built up since its legislative action was passed in 2012. More people driving increases the risk of driving fatality. Will intoxicated driving play into it? I'm sure, to a certain extent, but is there any reason to believe that this is the thing to focus on at the expense of all other factors, like people not wearing seatbelts and motorcyclists not wearing helmets, and the fact that they're dying at record rates? I don't think so. I think you need to take those things into account. You need to control for those factors, and not doing so is intellectually incredibly irresponsible when you go and make the claim that it's because people are driving home high. And the fact that it was a temporary increase makes even more sense and lends even more credibility to this notion, because the hype will fade eventually and people will go back to their normal lives. People won't keep coming from Narnia for years to get a little bit of weed if they have to drive hours to get it across state lines. It's both economically inviable, legally risky, because then you're crossing state lines with a federally illegal substance, and it's unnecessarily time consuming compared to calling up your buddy to get a gram or two. Now, I guess you could say that I'm focusing a lot on Colorado here in this video, but let's take a look at Oregon and Washington real quick. In Oregon, there was a massive reduction in traffic fatalities in 2017, but has been trending upwards since 2015. Is it due to cannabis? Maybe, but again, other factors may play into it, like a shortage of enforcement personnel that is currently at lower levels than it has been since the 80s, as between just 2010 and 2017, over 300,000 people moved to Oregon. Total driver miles are drastically up in recent years as well, and the fatality rate tracks similarly to that, as you can see by this graph. SSTI anticipated this alarming trend last year, pointing to the clearest cause, an uptick in driving. Over the last 2 years, vehicle miles traveled increased 6.4%, following a decade of historically low levels. As we noted last year, the strengthening economy has motivated people to drive more, but it also exacerbates the associated risk. For Washington, the latest data is 2015 provided by the Department of Transportation, and even with the spike between 2014 and 2015, they still sit well below the national average. In fact, the increase is smaller than that of the national average. Also, alcohol-related driving fatalities have increased since 2011 pretty significantly, when it started dropping in 2009 pretty significantly. The current value is actually 11 deaths higher in 2016 than in 2009, so this is worth keeping in mind as well. Maybe we should take Colorado Department of Transportation's lead, and instead of blaming cannabis, try to get people to wear their seatbelts more, design streets in ways that are empirically proven to be safer for motorists, and design strategies to improve the safety of pedestrians, which account for 84 such fatalities in 2016, by the way, of the total 606. Maybe try to somehow reduce alcohol-related fatalities, which, by the way, during 2016 killed 196 people, or accounted for 33% of driving fatalities. They report that 34 lives could be saved if everyone wore a helmet on a motorcycle, and 60 people could be saved if everyone wore seatbelts, where their current seatbelt wearing rate is around like 84%. We should acknowledge that in recent years, despite historic decreases in fatalities nationally, they are still up 8% nationally. And so this trend may not be restricted to Colorado, and this could explain why in neighboring areas you're also seeing this increase. It could be an association, and you may not be able to draw causation from these results. And another one I just thought of actually is distracted driving, which according to the NHTSA, 10 to 15% of driving fatalities can be attributed to distracted driving. CDOT does say that most driving fatalities are due to risky behaviors, and they actually name under that category not wearing a seatbelt, speeding, distracted driving, and driving impaired. But the point is, there are a lot of other factors that you could also point to. And with so many serious gaps in the cautious behaviors that people will exhibit behind the wheel, and how other things you can point to are actually trending, like motorcycle deaths without helmets, I think it's irresponsible to just start pointing fingers at cannabis just because it was made legal in some areas. Anyways, that's about all I have for you guys today. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, stay meducated.